Welcome back. In the first episode of this miniseries, we discussed the mythical history of Romulus and the founding of the Roman kingdom. Today, we are going to try and read in between the lines to find the truth in the myth. So was Romulus real? Were any of the events we talked about the last time real? Stick around to find out. Before we get any further into today's episode, I just want to quickly ask that you subscribe and like if you enjoy my content. It really helps the channel out and it motivates me to make more content. Now back to your regularly scheduled programming. I do want to quickly note that much of this is my own speculation, as all the records of the true founding of Rome were lost when the Gauls sacked the city in the 4th century BCE. The goal of this video is not to definitively tell you to completely throw out the myth, or to completely embrace it. Instead, I want to provoke your own thoughts on the matter, and I want to introduce some potential explanations or inconsistencies to try and give you an idea of where the myth actually stands in terms of authenticity. There are really two separate parts in questioning the story of Romulus. The first is, and this is probably the most obvious, was Romulus himself actually real? That is a tough question. Is it possible that a figure named Romulus existed and at some point was a king of Rome? Certainly. In fact, I would even say it's probable. However, is it possible that the idea of Romulus being the founder of Rome is simply wrong? Again, it is certainly possible. In any case, I think it is doubtful that the city of Rome was founded by a single person. Or in this case, I guess technically two people. We always forget about Remus. We know from archaeology that the area around the city of Rome has been inhabited since about 14,000 years ago. We also know that each of the 7 hills of Rome likely had a village on the summit. It seems that the village on the Palatine Hill in particular grew at a much faster rate than the surrounding hills and villages. I think the truth here is that each hill was likely inhabited by various groupings of Latins, the original Italic peoples in the area, and that over time, portions of the surrounding cities, such as Alba Longa, moved towards the 7 hills and slowly a city began to spring up. This would seem to line up with the mythical story, as it is likely that as Alba Longa lost population to the new city, some of the royal family, or at least the aristocracy, would move towards that new city. This could explain why in the myths, Romulus and Remus decide to establish themselves in the area of what would be Rome after restoring Numitor to the throne of Alba Longa. I think that in the end, Romulus may very well have been a real person, and even the name may have been accurate. I do have serious doubts that Romulus was actually the founder of Rome. Instead, Rome was likely a city that was slowly established over hundreds of years from immigration from surrounding cities. The second question is, at least for me, much more interesting to look at, and that is there any truth in the myths surrounding Romulus? To look at this question, we should start from the beginning. So was Romulus a member of, or born into, the Alba Longa royal family? Well, again, I think this is certainly possible, especially if Alba Longa was the city that contributed the most to the growth of the fledgling city of Rome. However, we also have some issues here, because the Romans were famous for embellishing their ancestors in history. It's much more prestigious and impressive for the first ruler of Rome to come from an established royal family in a city that was as religiously important as Alba Longa, than to have a ruler who simply emerged from being the richest or most powerful of those peoples who lived in the area of Rome. And this is all assuming that the city of Alba Longa really existed. The archaeological evidence for the city is mixed, and it is totally valid to question its existence. Of course, if Alba Longa did not really exist, then Romulus, either mythical or real, certainly did not descend from the royal family. It would seem to me then that in the end, Romulus was likely not a descendant of the royal family. I believe Romulus was likely the most powerful or richest local citizen, who through his wealth was able to assert himself as the leader of the fledgling city of Rome. The descent from Alba Longa likely came much later. As Rome began to dominate the local area, its ruling class probably looked for something to make them look like the rightful rulers. And what better way to do that than to craft a myth that their first ruler, Romulus, was descended from the oldest city of the Latins. Now we come to what is probably the most famous aspect of Romulus' story, his time being raised by the she-wolf Lupa. What's likely the true story here comes from his later adoption by Fastulius and his wife Acca Larenta. It's very likely that Romulus was actually the son of Fastulius and Acca Larenta, and was actually raised by the both of them in and around the small villages of the Roman hills. We come by even more evidence of this fact from Livy, who says that Acolorento was known as the she-wolf by the other farmers in the area due to her sexual promiscuity. This is really the start of our category of just blatantly false pieces of the legend. Sorry to burst anyone's bubble, but Romulus, even if he was a real person, was not raised by a wolf. Romulus was also not the son of the god Mars. Setting aside the question of were the gods real, that is not something I want to get into. The simple fact is that men of high stature of the period are almost always believed to be sons of the gods in some way, shape, or form. Alexander became, in part because of his own belief, known as the son of Zeus, even though we know, and so did the Macedonians, that his father was Philip, king of Macedon. Scipio Africanus was called a son of Jupiter, and the list goes on and on. The point here is that men who were successful were almost always believed to be sons of gods in both Rome and in Greece. So it really shouldn't be surprising that Romulus was believed to be the son of Mars, when in fact, he was probably just the son of a simple farmer in Fastulius. For the most part so far, we have ignored Romulus's twin, Remus. If we assume that Romulus was a real person, then it stands to reason that Remus was also real. Remember that Remus's main part in the story of Rome was to be the victim of a murder. Was it possible that the murder was actually real? Well, yes. Historically, siblings have competed for power for all of human history, and it's not necessarily uncommon for siblings to kill one another in the competition for that power. One needs to only look forward in Roman history to find another example of such a murder. The emperor, Caracalla, ordered his own brother Geta murdered by his Praetorian Guard just so that he would be the sole emperor. If we stick with the hypothesis that the real Romulus was actually just the most powerful or richest person in the area of Rome, then it is totally plausible that he saw his brother, Remus, as a threat to securing or keeping that power, and so either killed him himself or ordered his murder. It is very unlikely that the mythical story of Remus's murder is how it would have actually happened, as remember, it is very probable that the city of Rome was already beginning to grow at the time of Romulus and Remus. The twins likely had no part in picking which hill the city would start on. Instead, they likely competed on who would be the person to rule the new city, and this competition could have just as easily turned deadly. Romulus naming the city after himself is again totally believable. I mean, just look at Alexander the Great. He named roughly 70 cities after himself in some way. In fact, I can damn near guarantee you that if Romulus was a real person, and he was the first ruler of the city that would become Rome, that he would name the city after himself. I do, however, seriously doubt that Romulus was the founder of the Roman Senate, or the person who organized Rome into tribes. Remember, the Romans loved to find legitimacy for their institutions and traditions in the past. And really, who better to give that legitimacy than the city's first ruler himself? The probable truth is that the Senate slowly developed over time as a body to advise the king, or was even only established after the overthrow of the monarchy itself. The same thing likely happened with the creation of the tribes. As Rome grew and grew, the city likely needed some sort of way to classify its citizens, and thus the idea of tribes were born. Now, was Romulus the person to do that? Maybe. We have no real idea. We simply don't have the records to tell for sure. But this is really just another example of Roman historians making their own history sound grander and giving their institutions even more legitimacy. The rest of the myth is actually much more believable, and truly we could probably just leave the rest of the story alone and believe it to be true. However, I do think there are some interesting theories around the actual events that should at least be mentioned. Firstly, if we do just believe the myths, then I think it is completely impossible that Titus Tatius, the leader of the Sabines, died without the involvement of Romulus. I mean, come on. You become a co-ruler just a few years earlier, and then the person who was your co-ruler dies shortly after? That's a blueprint play. The rape of the Sabine women also likely did not happen in the same way the stories say. Of course, it would not be uncommon throughout history for cities or states to raid other cities and states in search of women to marry. However, I think here the explanation is much more likely to be something along the lines of integration or conquest. This aspect of the story likely serves as a way to integrate the Sabines in a way that lines up with the founding of Rome, and gives Romulus a justification for conquest of the Sabines in history. Perhaps the truth was that Rome and the Sabines simply agreed to become a single political entity under Titus and Romulus, and the Roman historians found that to be an unsatisfactory story. Maybe the Sabines even conquered Rome for a time, and Romulus was actually subordinate to Titus. This kind of makes sense when you consider that during their time as supposedly joint kings, Titus was able to block Romulus in most decisions we know about. In fact, the series of issues with Laurentum and Lavinium could actually just be rebellions by the two cities in Rome to overthrow Titus. I believe that in the end, this part of the myth is actually probably not far off from actual history. In some way, shape, or form, the Sabines and the Romans likely did come together as one political entity, and they did intermarry. The story likely was twisted in later histories just to line up with the much more mythical earlier history of Romulus. The rest of the story is likely believable until we get to Romulus's death. According to myth, Romulus went to heaven and became a god alongside his father Mars. The truth here is likely that Romulus either died of natural causes or was murdered due to his rising political clout. Livy even offers that Romulus could have been murdered by jealous senators. Of course, in the end, Livy chooses to believe that Romulus was raised to godhood, as it helps to establish that the Romans were favored by the gods. The truth here is likely far more simple. Romulus probably died of either natural causes or jealousy, neither of which are nearly as impressive as rising to heaven itself and becoming a god. It's pretty easy to see why the Romans would choose to believe that Romulus became a god, and it's easy to see why it would stick around. Alright, I'm gonna stop there. This video is really hard for me to make. Not only do a lot of these events have a ton of theories and possible explanations surrounding them, but I tried to do my best to bring you this information in a way that wasn't totally influenced by what I think or believe. That is, of course, extremely hard to do in a case like this, as really all of what we talked about is purely speculation, as we just don't have the sources to definitively determine the truth. I hope I did a good enough job of bringing to light the possible explanations. I encourage you all to do your own thinking on the issues, as it is really a fascinating subject. If you have any thoughts on the believability or the truth behind the myths, then please leave them down below in the comments and we can have a conversation about it. Also, I'm going to try to change up the visual aspect of the video starting next week, so be on the lookout for that. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something. Peace.